This is a special report from ABC News, the Moscow Summit. Now reporting live from Moscow, Peter Jennings.
Good morning. It's a lovely sunny day in Moscow, and President Mikhail Gorbachev and President Bush are about to do the most ceremonial duty of this summit. They're going to sign the START Treaty, that treaty which enables both the United States and the Soviet Union to eliminate for the first time strategic nuclear weapons. So it's a very symbolic day as well in the history of the relationship. Mr. Bush and Mr. Gorbachev have just come from the countryside. They are now in the Kremlin to sign this symbolic treaty marking the past relationship of these two countries. So let us listen.
Moscow, some will point
in Moscow and in the United States, they talk about concessions made to the Soviet Union. Others will argue that the treaty does not fulfill all hopes for the peace dividend, because a lot of money will have to be spent on the destruction of missiles. And if the missiles are not destroyed, the critics will say that they are obsolete and they need to be replaced by new ones. That's going to cost even more money. Strong criticism can be expected from those who want more rapid and far-reaching measures to for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. In other words, we're going to have to defend this treaty. I'm convinced we have done what is optimally possible at the present time and what is essential for further progress. A colossal amount of work has been done, and a unique body of experience of cooperation in a most complex area has been accumulated. An understanding of the absurdity of overarmament is gaining ground at a time when the world is increasingly interdependent economically, when the information revolution makes the integral nature of the world ever more evident. However, politicians are going to have to bear in mind that on the way towards that age, considerable efforts are going to have to be made to protect against the dangers from the past and new dangers. A change of heart and of mind is needed. Militarized political thinking, which had become rooted in the thinking of people, this has to be replaced, I say, by a new human approach, which will take time. And a new conceptual underpinning for security will have to be established. The doctrines for waging war will have to be replaced by doctrines for the prevention of war. Plans for the destruction of imaginary enemies must be replaced by concepts of defensive sufficiency and stability. The document before us is a moral accomplishment. It means a major breakthrough in the thinking and behavior of our countries. We must use the possibilities, the potential of this treaty and disarmament, and that is our purpose. We must pay tribute to what has been achieved and give credit to those who have worked so hard and put so much skill and mental energy into this task. The Soviet and the American peoples and the whole of the world community on the conclusion of such an agreement. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, and to President Gorbachev and members of the Soviet government and all the honored guests here, may I salute you. The treaty that we signed today is a most complicated one, the most complicated of contracts governing the most serious of concerns. Its 700 pages stand as a monument to several generations of U.S. and Soviet negotiators, to their tireless efforts to carve out common ground from a thicket of contentious issues. And it represents a major step forward for our mutual security and the cause of world peace. And may I, too, thank everybody who worked on this treaty, the military, State Department, arms control negotiators, really on both sides. And I would like to say that many are here today. Some, like my predecessor, President Reagan, is not here. But I think all of us recognize that there are many who are not in this room that deserve an awful lot of credit on both the Soviet side and the United States side. The START Treaty vindicates an approach to arms control that guided us for almost a decade. The belief that we could do more than merely halt the growth of our nuclear arsenals. We could seek more than limits on the number of arms. In our talks, we sought stabilizing reductions in our strategic arsenals. START makes that a reality. In a historic first for arms control, we will actually reduce U.S. and Soviet strategic nuclear arsenals. But reductions alone are not enough. So START requires even deeper cuts of the most dangerous and destabilizing weapons. The agreement itself is exceedingly complex, but the central idea at the heart of this treaty can be put simply: stabilizing reductions in our strategic nuclear forces reduce the risk of war. But these promises to reduce arms levels cannot automatically guarantee success. Just as important are the treaty's monitoring mechanisms, so we know that the commitments made are being translated into real security. In this area, START builds on the experience of earlier agreements, but goes far beyond them in provisions to ensure that we can verify this treaty effectively. Mr. President, in the warming relations between our nations, this treaty stands as both cause and consequence. Many times during the START talks, reaching agreement seemed all but impossible. In the end, the progress that we made in the past year's time, progress in easing tensions and ending the Cold War, changed the atmosphere at the negotiating table and paved the way for START's success. Neither side won unilateral advantage over the other. Both sides committed themselves instead to achieving a strong, effective treaty and securing the mutual stability that a good agreement would provide. Mr. President, by reducing arms, we reverse a half-century of steadily growing strategic arsenals. But more than that, we take a significant step forward in dispelling a half-century of mistrust. By building trust, we pave a path to peace. We signed the START Treaty as testament to the new relationship emerging between our two countries in the promise of further progress toward lasting peace. Thank you very much.
This is the third major arms reduction treaty in 4 years to require the Soviet Union to give up actually more weaponry than the U.S., even though Mr. Bush said that neither side won unilateral advantage. And as these two men sign this treaty, and symbolic and historic without question, they both must be aware of how changed the Soviet-American relationship is, with the Soviet Union a much diminished nation in every respect except the nuclear one. The other two treaties they've signed recently, 1987, they signed the Medium-Range Missile Reduction Treaty, and the Conventional Forces Reductions in Europe Treaty was signed in November of last year. But this is the one which both Mr. Bush and Mr. Gorbachev have made clear this morning so evokes the Cold War, the animosity, the half-century of mistrust, as Mr. Bush called it, which has in so many ways changed. Mr. Bush comes to Moscow at a time when Americans accompanying him who've come here over the last quarter or half-century simply do not recognize any comparisons between the environment then and the environment now. Now, you've heard a great deal in the last several days, undoubtedly, about what the START treaty actually requires. It's about, in round figures, about a 30% reduction in long-range nuclear weapons. In terms of the big heavy Soviet ballistic missiles, the most threatening ones, the SS-18s, they're cut by about 50%. And this all must occur within 7 years of the treaty actually being approved by the Senate and by the Supreme Soviet. There are a number of people here with us this morning, so let me bring them in, at least in terms of their voices, while we're watching what goes on in the Kremlin Hall this morning. We're joined from Washington by Senator Malcolm Wallop, a Republican from Wyoming. Senator Wallop, if I'm correct, you're one of those who thinks that the ratification process in the Senate for this treaty may not be an absolute breeze. Am I correct?
I think it should not be, because the Senate has the obligation to base its judgment not on what the current thought of some Soviet leaders' intentions are, but what the capability remains to threaten the American people after the treaty goes into place. So we necessarily have to look at it with some degree of skepticism. It's our job.
Given the fact that you are one of the skeptics, Senator Wallop, perhaps not quite as skeptical as Senator Helms, who told people not long ago that the Soviets were still, to put it politely, he said, still cheats and liars. Do you think it'll